You're listening to Addressing Gettysburg.
Hello, patrons, and welcome to this episode of Addressing Gettysburg. I am your host, Matt, as always. And, you know, we all love to study the story of what happened here at Gettysburg, the tactics, the human interest stories, etc. But how many of us actually try to glean life lessons from the decisions made by the various commanders during the Battle of Gettysburg and apply them to our careers, maybe our families, or just life in general? Well, Tom Vossler and Jeff McCausland have written the book called Battle Tested, to help you see the actions of these men in a way that can help you rethink the way you operate and perhaps make leaders of us all if we're willing to put in the work. Tom Vossler has been a licensed battlefield guide for 22 years. That's about almost as old as I am. He along with his co-author, Jeff McCausland, do corporate leadership seminars and staff rides. Jeff is a visiting professor of, I almost said internal. It's not internal. It's international security policy at Dickinson College. Both are alumni and formal faculty at the Army War College in Carlisle, as well as retired colonels. Jeff and Tom, welcome to Addressing Gettysburg.
Great to be with you.
Great to be with you.
Thank you very much. So you guys...
Happy Veterans Day.
Oh, yeah. Happy Veterans Day indeed. You guys started working on this book, was it 10 years ago, I believe? Or at least the seed of the idea of doing a book started 10 years ago?
Well, I guess the way to put it is 10 years ago we started doing leadership seminars and workshops on the battlefield for civilian corporations and businesses, and so we just kept doing that year after year, and then we finally 2, 3, 4 years ago, I lose track sometimes, we decided, well, why don't we put all this down on paper? Because we had a fairly decent routine that we did on the field on 1 day and 2 day workshops and seminars, and so we thought, well, you know, this might make an interesting book. So how's that sound to you, Jeff? That about right?
Yeah, that's about right. The one thing I think I would add is, as you mentioned, both Tom and I are faculty we're faculty at the Army War College. Tom was the director of the Military History Institute, which is the Army's archive. There's a huge repository. A lot of the photographs, for example, from the Ken Burns documentary on the Civil War were in that repository that Tom was in charge of. In my last few years at the War College, I was the Dean of Academics at the War College. And as part of that pick your course, we would take officers when they arrived, shortly after they arrived, down to Gettysburg for a Gettysburg leadership staff ride. It was a tradition that we did every single year. So Tom and I either participated or observed that during our time when we were at the War College. And some people may not realize that one of the reasons why the park was created back in the latter part of the 19th century was to afford the military a location to conduct military staff rides, professional development for military officers. And around Visitor Center and whatever, you look carefully, you can find photographs of not Civil War people, but later military officers on horseback and whatever going around the field doing just that. So having done that a number of times, we also started talking about it, and we began this seminar on the field. We determined that, you could use this as an enormous classroom, that Gettysburg in many ways was a case study that we could do. And secondary, we both agreed that, this whole idea of leadership, which we're going to get into in more detail, and we believe, good leadership is good leadership, and the principles and concepts are enduring. It doesn't matter whether you're talking about leading the Hebrews out of Egypt or leading during the Civil War or leading a corporation during a pandemic. There are certain concepts and principles that were, in fact, enduring. And then secondly, we became convinced that leadership is most clearly seen oftentimes when an organization is in a crisis, because crisis for any organization compresses time, and you can see good leadership and bad leadership much more distinctly. And clearly a battle is in its essence, you might say, two organizations that are in a crisis. And that's why, and the power of Gettysburg as an iconic event served as just a perfect case study to talk about leadership.
So you make a distinction in the book between a leader and a manager. And a lot of times today, especially like if you have a corporate job and you don't have someone with the military experience that you guys are coming from that perspective, teaching people about what makes a great leader. And they're really just going off of some hokey book that they bought, that isn't really based in, it's just a bunch of philosophies thrown out or something. But they often use the words interchangeably, leader and manager. But they're very different things, and you talk about this in the book. Go into that a little bit. What exactly is the difference between a leader and a manager?
Let me give that a shot, Tom, and you can chime in if you want.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, buddy.
We agreed early on a number of things, and Tom and I have worked together, as you said, pretty seamlessly for about a decade. And the first thing we grappled with is how is you're going to talk about leadership, how are you going to define this? Well, you can Google the word leadership, and you'll get hundreds of definitions. But we finally settled on the definition we both liked, which was leadership is the ability to decide what has to be done and then get people to want to do it. And that actually comes from Dwight Eisenhower. And coincidentally, of course, Eisenhower is a great leader in his own regard, 5-star general, commander of the all-Allied forces in the invasion of Normandy and the advancement into Germany during World War II. Subsequently President of the United States for 2 terms, and historians treat him a lot better today, I think, than when he left office in 1960. And a lot of people don't realize Eisenhower was also the president of Columbia University from the time he would leave the Army until he would enter the White House. Second of all, we found that definition brief. You can remember that's pretty succinct. Decide what has to be done, get others to want to do it. Then thirdly, we both found the second half of that definition appealing, get people to want to do it, because you might assume if you've been a 5-star general and the president of the United States and president of a major university, you just give orders and everybody snaps to their feet and rushes off and, as excited as they can get. But we've learned over our time, even in the Army, that to get maximum performance out of an organization, you've got to get them to buy into what this is all about. And that really, I think, is some of the essence of leadership. Now, clearly, these 2 terms, leadership and management, there is a Venn diagram here. I think they are more and more distinct as we go on in the 21st century. And successful organizations have to be well managed as well as well led. Management has to do, though, with the things you can measure, work standards, resource allocation, organizational design, how you control complex institutions is really what that's all about. And if you go back to the history of the study of management formally, you go back to around the start of the First World War when MBA programs appeared at places like Harvard University. Leadership as an area of distinct study is much newer in the last 25, 30, 40 years. And it has to do with vision, motivation, and trust, moving people and organization into the future, dealing with change, thinking in time. So to sum it up, I would say management has to do with data and complexity, and leadership has to do with change. And clearly we live in an era of just enormous change at warp speed, so successful organizations have got to learn to adapt very quickly to that. And once again, military officers involved in the battle find that need to adapt and learn and deal with change also critically important if they're going to be successful.
So one of the leaders you talk about in Chapter 2 is Buford. He's one of my favorites, and the more I learn about Day One, the more respect I have for John Buford. And you state that he was essentially the man who decided that if there was going to be a battle, Gettysburg is where the battle was going to be, or at least it would be a good place for it. And we know this in hindsight, but at the time, explain to me now, I've never been in the military. So he's a brigadier general. He's under the immediate command of John Reynolds, correct?
No.
No, okay, Pleasant.
Not really. He's under the operational control of John Reynolds.
Right.
Got it.
He's still under the command. Let me kind of go back a little bit.
Go ahead.
Let's go back to June 28th, where Buford and his division are down in Maryland at Middletown. He's going to receive orders from his commander, General Pleasanton, Chief Commander of the Cavalry Corps, and the orders tell him to leave one brigade down there in Maryland, Reserve Brigade, Merritt's Brigade. It's going to be left down at Mechanicstown, which is Thurmont today, and proceed with the remaining 2 brigades and 1 battery of artillery, and move so as to cover and protect the left flank of the left wing of the Army, commanded by Reynolds, as they move up from Maryland into Pennsylvania looking for the Confederates.
Okay.
So militarily, technically, Buford is still under the command of Pleasanton, but he's been opconned or placed under the operational control of Reynolds.
Got it.
And so we find Buford to even, and you're right about his assessment. He's one of my favorites on the field. And so he's working for three men. He's working for three bosses. He's working for his commander, Alfred Pleasanton. He's working for John Reynolds, for whom he's under operational control. And we find in his message traffic of June 30th, he's also keeping directly informed, George Meade. And so he is providing communications. We'll get it maybe later into discussion of communications, particularly from Buford, but he's sending information to three different men. And but he's under the operational control. So he has got to, when he arrives in Gettysburg, then he's got three things that he must do. One is to fulfill his orders to cover and protect the left wing of the line of march, or the left flank of the line of march of the left wing as they're moving up into Pennsylvania. So cover and protect are very specific military terms that he is going to have to adhere to. He's going to protect that force if they are attacked by the Confederates. And remember, one of their fears was that the Confederates would come in behind them rather than in front of them.
Right.
It'd come down through an area of Middle Creek and Tom's Creek down there below Emmitsburg, around Emmitsburg, and that they would come in that way. So he's going to protect that force as they're moving. The other things that he has to do is the second thing he has to do is he has to discover as much as possible about the size, the capability, and the intentions of the enemy force. Now, they have a fair idea operationally of where the Confederates are. What they don't know is, on a tactical level, exactly where they are. In fact, Meade himself, in a message to General Couch on the 30th of June, tells Couch he has no idea where Longstreet and Ewell are. He knows where A.P. Hill is, but he doesn't know where Longstreet and Ewell are. So one of Buford's duties as he arrives in Gettysburg on the 30th is he has got to decide, or got to find out where the Confederates are exactly and their capabilities, what's the size of their force, and what are their intentions, what they intend to do. The third thing he has to do is he has to conduct a terrain analysis. Should a battle be fought in the Gettysburg area, what is the key terrain that he has to provide, he has to protect for his force to occupy should there be a battle there in the Gettysburg area? That's where we say Buford is going to determine the location of the battle. He has no authority to commit the Army of the Potomac to a battle there. But if the battle happens, he's going to take those measures necessary to ensure that his people have the key terrain, that his army coming up behind him can occupy the key terrain should a battle take place there.
And that's something any good commander would do.
Any competent commander, yes.
Okay.
Yes. Any good, competent commander, those are the steps that he would take, and he took those steps.
So he doesn't have explicit orders to determine if Gettysburg or wherever would be a good place, but this is just something that his leadership style and his own sense of responsibility or whatever leads him to do. And so he's, as you said earlier, he's in the under the operational command of John Reynolds. So he's obviously the closest unit to him, and he says you call it what do you call it now? I forget. Leading the leader or leading the boss. Is that right?
The boss. Leading the boss to make the right decision. Provide the boss sufficient information for the boss to make the decision that you want the boss to make on your behalf.
Right.
Your favor. In other words, get up here.
Right. Yeah, because he says send up the infantry first thing in the morning.
Yeah.
And now, so my question about that is, if it was someone else that he was under the operational command of, how important is the leader's leader in that leader being a good leader?
Let me take a crack at that.
Go ahead, Jeff.
It's critically important, and we talk about a concept in various places throughout the book that I've developed called leadership in four directions. Everybody leads those who are their subordinates, their employees. Everybody leads their boss. More back to that in a second. And smart bosses want to be led. I always say, if you're on a ship, it doesn't do you much good if a sailor walks up to you and says, "Captain, we're 6 inches from an iceberg." That's interesting. It's just not terribly useful. If he comes to you and says, "Captain, we're 6 miles from an iceberg," now that's a useful thing to know. So everybody leads their boss, and smart bosses want to be led. Everybody leads or are led by their peer group, which can often be very, very difficult for human beings. And then last but not least, everybody leads themselves, which in many ways is the most difficult part of the four. In this particular case, we have two leaders, Reynolds and Buford, and they've known each other. They've worked together in the past. They have a certain amount of professional respect for each other. They've done what I would call the mind meld. So clearly Reynolds knows what Buford's mission is, as Tom very eloquently described. So when he sends that message back, hey, I've identified the Confederates to my west, leave there here in strength, get the infantry up here first thing in the morning. At that particular point, obviously Reynolds had several things he could do. I mean, he could have said, well, come back here, let's have a conference. I mean, let's create a committee and we'll study the issue for a while, He could have done all those things. But these two guys have worked together, and so John Reynolds quickly realizes John Buford says that's what we're supposed to do, even though he's a 1-star general, and equivalency today, Reynolds would be a 3-star general. That's what we're going to do. And as soon as he gets that message, he immediately accelerates the pace of the infantry heading up. So, Buford is leading the boss, and the boss has created a climate whereby he feels comfortable doing that. And that sort of climate that a leader creates of trust, confidence, therefore encourages initiative on the part of subordinates. And that's critically important, once again, I would argue, whether you're talking about a successful military operation or you're talking about, running a corporation or even a small business.
I mean, is this something that relies on like an interpersonal chemistry between, say Reynolds and Buford, or is this something that a person can learn to do and still influence their boss? Because who hasn't had a situation where they've gone to a boss, with information and whatever, maybe even a suggestion, and the boss almost petulantly refuses to consider it or whatever, because maybe they feel threatened or whatever the case may be. Right. Is there a way to finesse that, as the guy in Buford's case, if he had someone other than Reynolds above him, would he have been able to, is there a way that he could have finessed that whole thing?
That's a really good question. I think it comes back to the first thing you said. It's all about relationships, and leadership is about relationships. And that's why, back to that leadership management differentiation, management I often call it a science. I can measure things, I can measure outputs, I can measure profit and loss, I can measure those things. Leadership is more of an art form, really. Clearly, as a subordinate, you have a responsibility, I would argue, to lead your boss, because you want the organization to be successful. But you're right. I've got to think about my boss. I got to think about, is he or she, confident, or are they insecure, quite frankly? I got to understand what their objectives are, and I got to make sure I stay within those limits. And over time, I try to expand the confidence they have in me, and that will allow them to listen to me more often, and frankly, for me to have a greater influence with them. So that's part and parcel of the development of a leader. But the leader, again, I think, needs to understand that he or she cannot be successful in isolation. They can only be successful if they have subordinates that tell them what they need to know, even if they don't want to hear it. There's a great story, if you want to go back to the collapse of Enron back in 2007, I believe, which at the time was the seventh largest corporation in America. When Enron collapses, they discover that emails have been sent by Vice President to Ken Lay, who is the corporate president, saying, we're going to collapse in a wave of accounting scandals. They were fixing the books, what they were doing. It's unclear whether those messages ever got to Lay, or whether he had consciously or unconsciously created a system whereby only good news got to him.
Right.
He closed himself off. Okay. And that ended up being disastrous for him personally and for the corporation as a whole.
Going back to the original question, I think a lot of it has to do, for these two men, or speaking of Buford and Reynolds, a lot of it has to do with reputation,
right,
and military pedigree, and that these men come out of the old army, and they are not bosom buddies. We know that they're not bosom buddies, but out of that small army, they certainly know each other. Particularly after 2 years of civil war, they know each other by reputation, and both hold the other in high regard. So if Reynolds is going to receive a strong suggestion from Buford to all right, they're here, you need to come up here as soon as you can,
right.
And so then he's going to react accordingly. So a lot of it is direct empowerment. A lot of it is indirect empowerment through professional relationships.
Right.
Yeah, you say successful leaders allow themselves to be led by their subordinates or employees at crucial moments. Furthermore, a leader's willingness and ability to create a climate of leading the boss so they can be led is invaluable. And so it sounds like it's maybe a mix of a lot of different things. And, someone's innate ability, the leader's willingness and confidence in their own situation, their own position, their own abilities, and inabilities. Like, I think, to me, a good leader has to know his limits. He can't do everything. Nobody can do everything. And he has to be comfortable with that. And he has to be willing to find someone who can do what he can't do and empower them to do it. Am I wrong?
Exactly right. I mean, the one thing, leaders have to be self-aware, and they also have to understand how much risk they're comfortable with, because empowering others is a bit of a paradox, because when you do that, there is a certain amount of risk. Everything won't go perfectly.
Right.
Okay? And each of us has our own level of risk tolerance. I always tell folks, as soon as if you were totally risk adverse, you wouldn't get out of bed in the morning, because as soon as your feet hit the floor, it's a scary world out there. So we all have a certain degree of risk aversion. How much risk are you willing to take? And coupled with that, of course, on top of that is the whole question of accountability. Because when something goes wrong, I always say the first question everyone on the team is going to ask, or think of the first picture, I should say, is going to pop in their head is a picture of a bus. Why? Well, who's the boss going to throw into the bus when this thing went wrong here? And if the boss, excuse me, as a matter of course, when something goes wrong, immediately throws somebody under the bus very shortly, let me tell you what, there's not going to be a whole lot of initiative. There's not going to be a lot of being the boss, because the boss doesn't want to hear it.
Yep.
Okay. So when you do that, the paradox I've got to empower others, as you rightly point out, you can't do everything. But I have to embrace accountability for my team. We either succeed as a team or we fail as a team. And if I start holding people accountable and being a zero defects leader, then that ability to empower, the ability for them to lead me, and the ability for them to show the initiative goes right out the window.
Because you want to put them in a situation where they want to achieve what you set out for them to achieve. They want to do it.
Yeah, no, and I think you mentioned something about using words like we and our. And I think that's later on when we get to chapter 12 about Lincoln at Gettysburg, which we're going to move into now. But I think that's important regardless of who it is as a leader to make it no I. There's no I, there's no me. It's we, our.
Those personal pronouns mean a lot.
Yeah.
In the discussion. It's ownership. You're selling ownership in the solution to the problem.
Yeah. When I started doing this, not that I'm propping myself up as a big leader or anything, but when I started doing this podcast and things, I would often say we and our, and then people were like, you always say we and our, who else you got with you? And at the time, Eric wasn't with me. It was just me, but it was like a royal we. But I set out to do a lot of things with this. And one of them was to create a kind of a community of nerds that like to learn about this stuff. And if I start with the I and all this stuff, it sounds like I'm trying to start a cult. And so we and our is really what it is, because we're
Bill O'Reilly.
Well, it comes back to one other aspect of that definition of leadership. As I said to you before, we like this definition. The leader has to decide what has to be done and get others to want to do it, and that's fine. But there's one potential flaw in that definition, which circles into what we're talking about right now.
Yep.
And that is, if you just took that definition, then you'd have to say, well, gee whiz golly, Adolf Hitler, Joseph Stalin, Pol Pot, they were all great leaders because they decided what had to be done. Did they not? In their own eyes, they did, certainly. Did they convince others to want to do it, in some cases very enthusiastically?
Yeah.
They certainly did. Did they not? Would we all want to chorus together that these are great leaders we should emulate? Well, God, I would hope not. And so what's the bedrock in all this? And the bedrock in this is character, integrity, and ethics.
Right.
Character, integrity, and ethics. And I think if Eisenhower was on the call right now, he would probably agree with us and simply say, that's exactly right, but it's just totally implicit in any, Western democracy thinking about leadership, that character, integrity are a bedrock to establish trust in the organization. And if you are a leader of character, then you're into the whole idea of we versus I. And if you're a person of character, you're into the notion that if we only succeed or fail as a team, and so if we fail, I take the heat. I'm the heat shield for the organization because it's my team.
Yeah. I always thought of a good leader, as the energy source of a group. But he's not the end all be all. He's not a dictator. He knows how to, a good leader knows how to manage people.
Exactly.
In my mind. And he doesn't necessarily know how to manage data, because you got
to do a bit of both.
You got to do a bit of both, but one I think is a learned skill and one is something that you're born with.
Yeah, exactly right. And he has to deal with, I think, a whole bunch of different things that are going on in that equation. I mean, in terms of management of data versus people, it's interesting that there's very different things going on at Gettysburg. I mean, the Yankees have put together an ability to do intelligence analysis, and from that, they've got pretty much the order of battle by the end of the second day pretty well determined. And Major Van Sharp, who briefs me to run that little intelligence analysis, very rudimentary from our scale here in the 21st century, is able to brief him. So you could say Meade is making an informed decision off of data.
Right.
Whereas Lee doesn't have that, and of course Jeb Stuart's been gone, so he's been deprived of his primary source of information gathering. So he's really making informed decisions. He's intuitive decisions.
Intuitive.
Right.
Intuitive.
As opposed to informed decisions. So it's different. But they're both doing a little bit of both. This using data to think about it. Certainly the Yankees are. But you're also right. It's about the whole idea of relationships and inspiring people. And finally, the other part of that I think is important is, back to your idea about energy, I think the one thing that leaders are is they have to be the one that believe it's going to work and put a public face on it that this is going to work. I often say people in an organization may get to your level of optimism. They will rarely, if ever, exceed your level of optimism. Okay? Dwight Eisenhower, in the preparation for the invasion of Normandy in 1944, would tell his staff, we're not thinking about failure. This is going to succeed. He would say that over and over. Now, in his own private counsel, he certainly understood how close run this might be and how it could fail. And in fact, we write a note which he put in his pocket in which he said, the landings at Normandy have failed. The soldiers, sailors, airmen who are involved have done everything that anyone could expect. The failure is all mine. And he wrote that down, stuck it in his wallet in preparation in case things went south. And his aide found it several months later, and I think it's still available at the Library of Congress. But publicly, I'm optimistic this is going to work. I mean, I'm sure Robert E. Lee on the afternoon of 3rd July, 1863, in his public demeanor and in that very important conversation he has with James Longstreet, he is saying this is going to work, Pete. This is really going to work.
It almost sounds like Eisenhower just took a cue from Lee. I mean, he had basically the same, this is all my fault, mea culpa in his pocket just in case it went bad.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Right. And the interesting thing about Lee in that regard is, and Tom and I have talked about this, and Tom is my historian, and chime in if I got it wrong, old friend, has done the research. We cannot find any example after the fight is over until he dies where Robert E. Lee blames anybody but himself. He could have blamed, obviously, Jeb Stuart for going off and getting lost, and I'm without you for a week or 10 days. He could have blamed A.P. Hill. Hey, by the way, Hill, I told you not to get decisively engaged. What the heck are you doing here, guy?
Right.
He could have blamed Richard Ewell. I told you to take that hill if practical to do so on the afternoon of the 1st day of July, and you didn't do it. He could have blamed Pete Longstreet, who, when he argued, did not move as swiftly as Lee had wanted him to do on the 2nd of July. He could have blamed any of those guys. But to the best of my knowledge, I have never found an instance where Robert E. Lee blamed anybody but took the credit, or took the blame, if you will. And, of course, after the battle's over, we'll write a letter of resignation to Jefferson Davis, accepting responsibility for the loss of Gettysburg, which, of course, Davis rejects, and Lee stays in command. So it's, to Lee's credit, he does embrace that notion that it's my team. We succeed or fail, but if we fail, it's my responsibility.
Another chapter that I read was chapter 12 about Lincoln's visit here. And one thing you do throughout the book that I like is you pose a question to the reader, like a what would you do type of thing.
Yeah.
And at one point you talk about how, Lincoln got the invitation, what was it, 2 weeks before the dedication day, I think it was, right?
I think you got it on the 3rd of November for an event on the 19th, so 16 days, I think is right.
Yeah, okay. So, Mary Todd doesn't want him to go because Tad was sick and, Willie had died, what was it, the year before or 2 years before? And
1862, yeah.
60, yeah, the year before. And, so that's fresh in their mind and everything like that. But he comes up anyway. And when you kind of pose the question, what would you do in this situation if this is what you were dealing with? And to me, I never really thought of that before. And it made me think, it's just, a leader also kind of has to sacrifice a lot of things that a lot of us are not willing to do, like going on a trip to Gettysburg for the good of the nation, and maybe, or, for a political purpose or for a greater cause while your family needs you. Then that's got to be a tough thing to do. But history is just strewn with stories of leaders having these struggles, something going on at home, but I have to do this because I'm leading the country, or I'm leading this army, or whatever it may be. Is that what a good leader has to do sometimes? I mean, I guess it kind of is, right? It's kind of a stupid question, but...
Well, no, I think you're exactly right. I mean, it gets to 2 points I'd make. One is, we talk about this in the book in several places, and I use this as part of that paradigm. Leaders have to lead themselves, which can be the most difficult part of the whole equation. So Robert E. Lee for a second, there's pretty good evidence, frankly, that Robert E. Lee is not at his physical best during these 3 days of Gettysburg. There's some evidence that he has a problem with his sciatic nerve problem, perhaps in his back. There's some reason to believe that the heart disease that's going to kill him a few years after the war is starting to cause him problems. There's very clear evidence from diaries that he's suffering from what was then referred to as old soldier's disease or dysentery. So he's not exactly at his physical best. Mm-hmm. But he, as you suggest, has got to suck it up, and because I'm in charge, and this is a critical moment for the organization. And the same is true for Abraham Lincoln. To this day, and I worked in Washington, worked in the White House, we used to have a saying back in those days in Washington, and I think it applied in 1860 and applies today. If you want a friend, buy a dog. Okay, so that's the first thing you got to do, because being a leader in an atmosphere like that is a very, very lonely experience. And you try to find some balance between your professional responsibilities and your personal responsibilities. And Lincoln is wrestling with that. But back to the whole thing, I find fascinating just to think about, because as you say, he gets his invitation on the 2nd of November. He's not the primary speaker. He's only going to make a few remarks. Primary speaker, of course, is Everett. He got his invitation on the 23rd of September. Okay, so about 6 or 8 weeks before Lincoln got his.
Right.
In fact, he even had them extend the date of the ceremony because he wanted more time to prepare.
Right.
Everett, very distinguished guy. Actually, you could argue a political opponent of Lincoln, because he had run as vice president on the Union Party ticket back in 1860 against the Republican Party. And so I'm the second banana to a guy who was my political opponent. What's wrong with this? So
Yeah.
Presidents don't travel that much. The war's going on. There's things going on in November of 1863. Grant is still trying to figure out what he's going to do, and in the West in particular, what's going on with Sherman or whatever. So there's things going on. But Lincoln, not only did he come up, his staff even suggested to him, hey, we can go up that morning and have you back that night, And Lincoln is very adamant, no, I'm going to go up the night before because I've got to make sure I'm there.
Right.
And to me, there are really two drivers, and we can talk about it more if we want. One is Lincoln understands the 3 laws of politics. We talk about him as a great leader, but he's also a great politician.
Sure.
He understands the 3 laws of politics are get elected, get reelected, and don't forget rules 1 and 2. And it's 1 year from an upcoming election campaign in 1864. And most people in the United States in the summer 1863, or fall of 1863 rather, probably would have told you that not only is Abraham Lincoln not going to get reelected, we don't even think he's going to get the nominations of the Republican Party.
Mm-hmm.
But he knows every governor, senator, congressman are all going to be in Gettysburg. So if there's going to be some politicking done largely by his staff, this is going to be an ideal moment to do that. He and Governor Curtin, not exactly bosom buddies, might mend a few fences with Curtin while I'm there. So there's some political motivation. And second of all, then to the speech, I think he understands the power of timing. Leaders understand that time is a resource they have to manage, but also the power of timing. What is the right moment to do something? And I think he realizes, I want to talk about the vision for the war, and at this moment, every newspaper and every senior leader in the country is going to be in this small village in Pennsylvania. This is an ideal opportunity if I'm going to describe an expanded vision for the nation.
You also talk about stakeholders in that chapter. And first off, what do you mean by stakeholders in this context?
Well, stakeholders in any organization is those people who've got to buy in. It's back to that getting people who want to do it. And obviously for a politician, who are the stakeholders? For Abraham Lincoln, the stakeholders you might put in 3 large groups. One is the Army. I got to keep the Army on my side, and I've obviously had some issues with that with the generals I've been firing throughout my tenure so far. Number 2, I've got to keep the government on my side, and that includes the politicians on both sides. And Lincoln does a good bit of that. I mean, it's amazing how many Democrats that Abraham Lincoln makes generals, because one way to keep the Democrats interested in the war is to get them to be a stakeholder, get them to have some skin in the game. And then third, and certainly not least important, are the people, the voters. They are the ultimate stakeholders. They're my boss.
Right.
If I don't get them on my side, if they don't buy into what direction I want to go, I don't get reelected.
They're the ones who are sending their sons off to die.
Exactly right. Exactly right.
You better get them on your side.
Yeah. So those are the stakeholders, and you can translate that in any organization. Any organization's stakeholders, certainly their employees. Second stakeholder are their clients or their customers. Okay. Third stakeholder, if you're a large organization, is do you have a board? And oftentimes the relationship between the corporate board and the corporate leadership is one of the most fascinating relationships to me to determine how well or how poorly an organization succeeds or fails. Those are all different stakeholders.
Back a few months ago, I don't remember when it was, August, September, something like that, President Trump was toying with the idea of announcing his candidacy here at Gettysburg. And a few of my listeners emailed me, and they said, "Did you see this? You cannot let this happen." And I said, "Who the hell am I? Because I live here? Like, what am I? What do you think I have a say in this?" And I said, so I thought this was interesting, and I engaged them, and I said, "Well, why not?" And they said, "Because we can't let him, use that place for political purposes." And I said, "Well, maybe you should talk to Abraham Lincoln." Well, and they were like, "What?" And because it's how dare you? It's almost like criticizing Jesus. And I said, "Well, what do you think the Gettysburg Address was?" And it's funny because we have to memorize it in 5th grade, or we used to have to. I don't know if they still do that anymore. And it's a thing that we memorize. It's beautifully written. I don't think most people really know what the words mean. Or maybe they don't even know the context of it, which is weird. But my point is that we don't think of it as a political speech, but it is.
It is.
And he was using this sacred ground, this hallowed ground, however you want to say it, to get attention for his political message.
Exactly.
And
I like.
Yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say exactly right. The speech to me is a perfect example that any leader can use to organize his thoughts or her thoughts when talking to their organization about the direction or the revised direction we want to take.
Providing a strategic vision.
Yeah, and the 2 parts are where we've been, I should say, 7 years ago, which takes you back to the signing of the Declaration of Independence in 1776, which Lincoln thought was the foundational document. We hold these truths as self-evident that all men are created equal. Where are we right now? We're met on a great battlefield of this war, and it's right and proper. And then thirdly, where are we going? And the last part of the speech, we're going to a new birth of freedom. So I firmly believe that when on the afternoon of the 19th of November, the purpose of the war is to preserve the Union. That's what Abraham Lincoln talked about in the first inaugural address, very, very candidly. That's what it was all about, preserving the Union. But by the time he finishes at Gettysburg, it's still about preserving the Union, the unfinished work. But now it's also about slavery and ending slavery. And these two things now are inextricably linked.
Mm-hmm.
And, of course, he will run for re-election in 1864 with a plank and a Republican platform of ending slavery, which many of his senior advisors in the Republican Party tell him is a loser. You got to drop this thing because, you can pick it up after you get elected, but you can't talk about this now. And Lincoln says, no. I think he used the word, I'll be damned forever if I should do that, because, of course, by that point, 1864, he's had nearly 200,000 African-American soldiers enter the Union Army, suffer casualties at rates higher than actually their white counterparts.
Mm-hmm.
And so they are now stakeholders, too, in this future for the nation. And, one last point on this, that we use this as a vision. I always like to contrast that with then his second inaugural in March of 1865, jumping ahead. Think about it for a minute. He goes to give the second inaugural, huge crowd, standing there on the steps of the Capitol. But everybody in the crowd had lost somebody probably by that point. 600,000 people have died, whether it's a brother, father, cousin, son, whatever, or seen one grievously wounded. Lincoln could have got up, and because they knew they were winning the war by that point, could have got up on the platform that day and said, okay, we're winning the war, and oh, by the way, when the war's over, I'd just like you to know that I'm going to hang Robert E. Lee right here. I'm going to hang Jefferson Davis right next to him and going right down the list. And my guess, most people in the crowd would have looked up and said, that works just fine for me. I think that's not a bad idea at all.
Right.
So what does he talk about? Back to this vision and timing and the moment to convey a direction. With malice towards none, with charity towards all, bind up the nation's work.
Yeah, the man, we were lucky we had him when we did.
Do what?
And not only was he a good leader, his writing, his words. Did we lose the call there? Oh, okay. Sorry, are you guys there?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. We had a call waiting kind of bleep in there. But his okay, I gotcha. His writing, his words, the words he chose, he just had a great way of getting through to the patriot in everybody and the decent human being or the better angels of our nature in everyone. And that he's one of the best out there. Well, guys, thank you very much for doing this. I hope, one day that you're not that far away. You come into the studio and we can sit and talk more about the book or whatever.
Yeah.
And
we'd do that. We'd do that.
Yeah, that's and so the book is called Battle Tested. It's available on our recommended reading page on Amazon, Barnes and Noble. You can go to diamond6leadership.com. That's diamond, the word 6, leadership.com. You can get the book there. And Jeff, that's your lead. Explain to me what that is again. I'm sorry.
What Diamond 6 is? Diamond 6 is a company that I run. Tom is my lead historian. We do executive leadership workshops, frankly, all over the United States. For corporate leadership teams, we've worked a lot with large leadership teams from large school district leadership teams from all over the United States, particularly in Los Angeles, St. Louis, the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area. And we do that. We've been doing that for years. And we like to use historical case studies as one of those parts of those workshops or as an individual standalone seminar for those groups. And frankly, do other ones. I'm off to Texas in early December to run a workshop at the Chester Nimitz Library in Frederick, Texas. Doing a case study we do on the attack on Pearl Harbor, and we've done one on using the Battle of the Alamo. And Tom and I also have done leadership workshops using the Battle of Bull Run and the Battle of Antietam. Gettysburg remains, if you will, I'd call our flagship.
Flagship, yeah.
Sure.
It's our flagship.
Experiential one, yeah, without a doubt.
Do you do one on the Little Bighorn?
We've talked about that. We've also done the Battle of Yorktown, which is a fascinating one. And what's really kind of cool, I have to say, and Tom and I have been to all these places together, but I've been a couple extra ones. It's just so you guys know it from being at Gettysburg. It's one thing to talk about leadership concepts and principles or listen to this podcast, which is a great way to do it, and I commend you for doing that.
Thank you.
But if you're standing in the cemetery at Gettysburg where Lincoln gave the Gettysburg Address, or you're standing, as I have, on the deck of the Arizona talking about what's it like to be part of a team.
Oh, not in the Arizona, the New Jersey.
Well, the Jersey, but
the Arizona. Okay.
Oh, yeah, right. You'd be pretty wet if you were on the deck.
Yeah, you're talking about, you stand in, as I've done in Surrender Field at Yorktown, and talk about, ending a conflict and conflict resolution. I mean, or to teaching leadership and tying it to history. I mean, if you can talk about these things in those locations like Tom and I have done, and for most people, if hair on the back of your neck doesn't go up, then I'm wondering, maybe a pretty insensitive human being.
Yeah,
well, you guys would appreciate that. Last September of last year, Jeff and I were with Stuart Dempsey in Normandy.
Yeah, that's right.
And so when you're standing at Omaha Beach, where the 16th Regiment of the First Division came in, and you look around and you say, "Really?" and then you climb the bluffs and go up to the cemetery and you look down and it's really
or you go to Pond Hawk and look down where the Rangers climb the cliff.
Yeah.
All right.
Take the gun. Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing to do. For me, when I go to the cemetery, the part that gets me is the unknown sections, the largest unknown sections. To me, that's the saddest of them all, because nobody knows who they were, and their parents never knew exactly what happened or where they are, or they have no grave to visit. It's sad. But yeah, you have to go to these places, and that's what we always encourage our listeners to do, is don't just read about it, don't just listen to us. Come out here and see these places. And yeah. But my other favorite battle is Little Bighorn, and I would imagine you would use that as an example of what not to do.
You certainly could, but you have to. One of the things you have to do when you do these kind of things, it's easy with the Union and Confederacy. When you do Pearl Harbor, which I've done, or you do Yorktown, which I've done, you have to kind of try to park your own personal prejudices. And you got to look at it from the other guy's perspective. What were they trying to accomplish? What was their strategic vision? And that, I think, gets people to think in different patterns. So, the Little Bighorn, you need to think about what Custer and the Federal Army's objectives were, but also what the Indians' objectives were. Same at Pearl Harbor. What were the Japanese actually trying to accomplish, and how well did they meet their own strategic goals? And that gets the people into a whole different, I think, frame of reference in thinking about it. And then, of course, using those kind of places which are iconic and somewhat emotional, I think gives the educational experience a certain stickiness. They may set to 100 college courses, but if they talk about these concepts, standing at locations like we just mentioned, that sticks with you for the rest of your life.
Yeah, it does. Well, Tom and Jeff, thank you very much for doing this. Like I said, ladies and gentlemen, Battle Tested is the book. It's available on a recommended reading page, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. You can go to diamond6leadership.com. Gentlemen, thank you very much for coming on Addressing Gettysburg.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
You're absolutely welcome. Thank you. Thank you all for listening. All right, guys. Okay. That was great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, and if I say, send us a copy of the tape and we'll pump it out on social media, and next time we're down to Gettysburg, we'll come look you guys up. Oh, yeah. I'll tell you what. In fact, do you have my email address?
Yeah, I was just going to ask for that, actually, if I can get both of yours.
Yeah. Okay, my email address is mccauslj, as in Jeff, at comcast.net.
McCausland J at Comcast.
Yeah, McCausland J, not the whole last name, but just mccauslj.
Oh, okay. No A-N-D.
No, there's no A-N-D on the email.
Comcast. And Tom, do you have one?
Tom? He might have dropped off.
I think he hung up.
I can tell you what it is. Hang on a second. Give me one.
Oh, fair enough.
It's T. Vossler, T-V-O-S-L-E-R. Wait a second. I was getting ready to send him an email. It's like, right here. Yeah, here we go. 1 second. All right. T. Vossler, Vossler at Comcast.net as well.
At Comcast. Alrighty.
And you know what I'm going to do, Jeff? Like I said, this is going on the subscription feed, but I'm going to make it available for free for like 3 months so that you could share it and people could hear it and promote the book. Because,
Because, one thing that it may be useful for you guys, I don't mind doing it all, as I mentioned before, we have an awful lot of school district leadership teams that we've worked with. And these are big districts. Like our biggest client is a school district in Southern California, and they have 65,000 kids in the school district.
Oh, my God.
We got another one that's got 50,000 kids in the district.
Wow.
So they come out and do leadership workshops on strategic planning, individual development, whatever. We don't do the kids. We're talking about superintendents, principals, and that kind of stuff. But we'll put it out. We have a newsletter, and I'll put it out in the newsletter. And it now goes out, because we've been doing this for so long, to 5,000 or 6,000 people. A lot of them are those educators. And then a lot of them are looking for material like you all have got that they can then integrate into courses they're doing, particularly for middle school, high school age kids, I would imagine.
Well, that's good.
That's awesome.
We actually, I've heard from teachers before that say that they play our episodes in their class, or they assign them to the kids. Or I've also heard from homeschoolers who let their parents listen to it too. So yeah, so that's why we try not to curse, and if we do, we bleep it out because we know we have kids listening. So
Yeah, I hear you.
all right, Jeff. Well, we'll get that to you once it's done and up, and you can share it however you like.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
All right.
Did you hear a crackle?
The whole freaking time. It was his connection. It wasn't you. It was Jeff's connection.
Fuck it, dog.
Well, here's what.
I thought it was the goddamn cable.
No. Although when you moved it, it did.
I heard that. Yeah.
But it wasn't the cable. So apparently, then that is not for phone calls. That is because that you had Jeff on your phone, right?
Yeah.
So and Jeff heard us, so it does work that way, but it didn't work with Tom on the Bluetooth.
No.
But Tom on the Bluetooth
could hear Jeff.
Jeff on the Bluetooth
could hear Jeff. Jeff couldn't hear Tom.
Right. Okay. So then this, I think, is really if someone wants to play a clip of something. Well, it works for the phone too, but I'm saying it's not gonna. I don't know. I gotta research that more. There's a lot this thing can do. There's a lot more than I realized that this thing can do, and I don't know what half of it is.
I guess we couldn't. It wouldn't matter anyways if we were able to connect both phones via Bluetooth to it. I don't think that would.